Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the Criminal Justice Group event this afternoon. My name is Reid, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Laura Knight shortly. But I just wanted to make you all aware that the format for this afternoon is that we'll have a presentation from Dr. Laura Knight from the Youth Endowment Fund regarding a toolkit that they've developed. Then we'll have a brief question and answer session where we'll invite yourselves to pop any questions in the chat or to verbally speak to us. We are now going to move into the presentation from Laura. So I'm going to hand over. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Laura, and agreeing to present to us. We look forward to hearing your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Wayne. Hi, everybody. So I'm Laura Knight. I'm the Toolkit and Evidence Engagement Lead for the Youth Endowment Fund. So I'll start by introducing the Youth Endowment Fund and then move into this fun toolkit that we've got to share with you. I'm quite happy for this to be an informal session, so please do just jump up with questions, any comments in the chat, whichever way you prefer to interact. But yeah, very happy to take questions throughout. And just to introduce myself, so I have a background in research and evaluation across a number of different sectors. So I started out in policing, moved into academia for a while, spent some time working on evaluation and research in the charity sector as well, but mostly with a focus on crime and justice and early intervention and children and young people. So started with the Youth Endowment Fund just over a year ago and been working really hard on developing this toolkit. And there's a lot of evidence in here to share with you today. So I will provide an overview, but hopefully you can come back to me with more detailed questions after the session. So to introduce the Youth Endowment Fund, so we are a charity that was set up in 2019 with a £200 million endowment from the Home Office. So we are independent from the Home Office. We're not civil servants. We are an independent charity. But the Home Office set this big mandate, this bold vision for a world where no child becomes involved in violence, and set up the Youth Endowment Fund to contribute to that vision through developing knowledge about what works, and to put that knowledge into practice. So that means that we do a lot of research and evaluation and gathering insights and information and then sharing that with people that are working across lots of different organisations and sectors that have a shared vision for reducing children and young people's involvement in violence. So I'll just talk you through briefly our sort of strategy slide. So this is what YEF does on a page. So the three columns in front of you, I'll start with the blue one in the middle. So we fund good work. So that basically means that the vast majority of that initial funding that we got from the Home Office goes into paying for promising projects and programmes. So we run grant rounds and we fund projects that tests different approaches and interventions to reducing children and young people's involvement in violence. And then we fund independent evaluations of those to capture the learning. We also have quite a small data team in YEF, so they do a lot of work looking at existing data and information that's available to look at trends and changes over time in children and young people's involvement in violence, looking at the causes and some of the consequences. And so we periodically produce reports from that. And then we also have what we call a peer action collective, which is where we have worked with children and young people across the country to develop their skills in conducting research. And then they've gone off and undertaken their own research projects to understand the causes and factors that are involved in violence. And they've actually shifted that research into social action projects. So we've got young people that are undertaking their own research and really trying to drive change around reducing violence. And in that middle column, the yellow column, the finding what works. So like I say, we fund these independent evaluations of all of the projects and programmes that we fund. And so we produce evaluation reports from those, and you'll see those all on our website. And then some areas of work have a lot more evidence and information than others. So at this point, I'll just introduce our focus areas on the left here. So YEF works with 8 focus areas. I won't talk through them all right now because it would take a bit of time. But if you see these overall focus areas topics on the left here, They basically pull together some of the main types of interventions and approaches that can be used to reduce violence. And these are areas where we've seen promising practice. There's evaluations, there's insights, there's research. And so in the middle box under the yellow column there, we've got these guidance reports. So we are going through a process of producing guidance reports across each of those 8 focus areas. So we'll be producing a guidance report on diversion at the end of the year. So if you've got any questions about that or the focus areas more generally, very happy to take them. And then the final box in the Find What Works column is the toolkit, which is what I'll be focusing the presentation on today. But just very simply, the toolkit looks at what's the available evidence across different interventions and approaches, and really tries to summarise the evidence that's available to provide you with a really high level, easy to read summary of the average impact of different interventions on reducing violence. And it helps you to compare those different approaches to each other. And then on the right hand side in the red column, we have a change team. So that's people that are out there talking to people across multiple different sectors. So the youth sector, policing, local authorities, schools, youth work and so on, to really make sure that we're understanding what's currently happening and being delivered across services, and also to talk through what we're learning from all of this work that we're funding and these evaluations that we're funding, and making sure that we're getting that knowledge into the hands of people that can actually use it. So to home in then on the toolkit. So like I say, this is a space where we summarise the best available research. So at the moment, there are 25 different interventions that are included in the toolkit. And if you just search for YEF Toolkit online, you should easily find it. It's a free online resource. And for each of the interventions that are included in the toolkit, we provide you with a really high level impact rating for reductions in violence, and then a simple description of what is the type of intervention that we're talking about, and give you some ideas around how best to implement that type of approach. So the idea is that we've made it as simple to read as possible, with the knowledge that stakeholders like yourselves often don't have a lot of time to read what can be quite lengthy research papers, and often those research papers are trapped behind paywalls. And then even if you do get past those paywalls, often you might read 2 or 3 research articles about an intervention to reduce violence, and you might see different results and go away from it thinking, I don't know what to do with that I found. So the toolkit looks at all of that available research and summarises it to give you, on average, what can we learn from this research. And so when we talk about using the toolkit, when we talk about using that evidence, we say we want it to support people to take decisions about what to invest time, energy and resources in for violence prevention. But that needs to be done alongside what you know from your local context. So you might have local strategic needs assessments, you might have problem profiles that expand on the challenges around violence prevention in your local area. You might have consultations with children, with young people, with families, that provide you with insights about engagement and access to services in your local areas. So we want the toolkit evidence to sit alongside this other local contextual information that you've got, and to support you to make decisions in ways that we call best bets. So the evidence in the toolkit will tell you about what we've learned when these interventions were tested in different locations and at different times. And so that can give us a really good insight about the likely impact that different interventions can have, but you won't really know the impact until you test it in your area. So that's why we talk about best bets. And then we also use the toolkit evidence for a bigger sort of change programme. So that kind of evidence really gives us a foundation for having conversations at the national level about different types of service provision and how to meet the needs of children and young people. So to start to get into the weeds of the toolkit then, So like I say, when you click into the toolkit for each intervention type, and there's 25 in there at the moment, you get this overall headline impact rating, and then you get a summary of that intervention type. So it explains what is it, how effective is this, how do we know, what do we think about the evidence, and it will provide some useful links and resources for you as well. And for those of you that really like to get into the detail, right at the bottom of each of those pages is the technical report, which explains to you how it is that we've pulled together the research evidence available and come up with that summary. So there is more detail there for you if you want it. So this is what the YEF Toolkit front page looks like. So if you do click on the site, you'll see something like this when you land on the page. So I'm just going to talk through one of these pink summary cards to give you an idea about how we pull together the information to produce this summary rating and how you might interpret it. So you'll see we've got two pink summary cards on this slide. So one for social skills training and one for a programme that's called A&E Navigators, so Ambulance and Emergency Room Navigators. So I'll just take social skills training for now. So what you'll see here is a very brief description of the type of intervention. So social skills training aims to develop children's ability to regulate their behaviour and to communicate effectively. So we try in one sentence to tell you what types of interventions are we talking about here. But there's a wide variety of different interventions often under the same heading. So we do urge you to click in and have a look, make sure we're talking about the same thing. So for each intervention type then, we've got these three key pieces of information that we provide. So these are in the slightly darker pink boxes in front of you. So starting from right to left. So for social skills training, we're saying the best available research is telling us that on average, social skills training can have a high impact on reducing violence. And so that means that from the research available, we've been able to look at each of the individual evaluation effects and impacts and pull together an average impact rating of high. And it's really important that you consider that impact rating alongside the evidence quality rating that's next to it. So that middle column there, you'll see this evidence quality rating displayed in magnifying glasses. So for social skills training, this is scored a 4 out of 5 on these magnifying glasses. And so what that means is we've got high confidence in that overall average high impact rating for reducing violence. So that means that we feel quite confident about the reliability of the research. So the way that we produce that score is we look at the number of research studies that have produced that average impact. And we also look at how much variation there is underneath that average. So if you've got an average of 3 research studies, that's considered quite low. So we would knock an evidence quality rating down for that. And then if you have an impact rating that's based on 33 studies, we'd say there's a lot more research there, but then you do need to look at the amount of variation that there is in the results there. So if there was a high level of variation across those 33 studies, we'd knock the evidence quality rating. So it's giving you an idea about how much research has informed this average and how much variation is there underneath that. And then we also rate the review of the average and the research that was undertaken to produce that average. So what you want to know is if one of these averages is produced from 33 studies, you want to know that the people that produced that review didn't go and just cherry pick all of the studies that have the best results or the most positive results. You want to know that they've really systematically searched for research evidence that's available for that intervention and did a good quality job of pulling that information together, reducing any of those biases that can creep in and impact that overall result. And so we use that as well to inform how confident we feel about that overall impact rating. And also we're focused on violence prevention. So we are looking specifically for violence and offending outcomes, and we're looking for outcomes specifically for children and young people. So those are also things that we consider at that point. So at this point, I'll point out the A&E Navigator programme at the bottom here, because this gives you a little comparator. So A&E Navigators are caseworkers that work in accident and emergency departments to support children and young people that arrive with a violence-related injury. And so what we're telling you here is, on average, from the research available on A&E Navigator programmes, they can have a high impact on reducing violence. But we've given this a score of 1 out of 5 on evidence security, which is very low. So this is us saying we've got very low confidence in that result because this is based on only a few studies. And so that doesn't allow us to have high confidence in that result. And so YEF is funding more research to look at the impact of A&E Navigator programmes to hopefully build up that evidence quality rating and tell us a bit more reliably about the impact of these programmes. And then the third key piece of information that we give you about these interventions is cost. So that middle column that you see there. And so this is very simply a low, moderate or high cost rating, displayed there in pound signs. And this really equates to something like a low cost intervention might be around £500 or less per child or young person going through the intervention. And an intervention that was rated as high cost might be something like £1,500 per child or young person going through the intervention. So that just gives you an idea. But this is all relative to the other interventions that are in the toolkit. So some of those thresholds are likely to change over time as we add more and more interventions and learn more about the average costs of different interventions being delivered. So hopefully that helps you to know what you're looking at and thinking about on these overall headings for each of the intervention types. And just to briefly point out, on the left here, when you're on the site, you can narrow down the number of interventions that you're looking at by using these filters on the left. So if you just want to look at interventions that have got a good level of evidence quality, so you want to look at those maybe with high or very high evidence quality, you'd use that toggle at the top and move it up to 4 and 5. If you just want to look at those that have a high impact on violence prevention, for example, you'd use that middle toggle. And then if your focus is on actually, we need to be looking at low cost interventions, this is where we are at the moment, then you're able to filter for that as well. And where possible, we do provide other outcomes. So some of the interventions that we include in the toolkit, their main focus wasn't necessarily violence prevention, but several evaluations have had a look at whether those interventions have an impact on violence prevention. So where there's other outcomes that the programmes were testing that are relevant, we share that with you. So social skills training, for example. So often this is with young children in primary school, and the focus is developing their social skills and their emotional identification and emotional regulation. And a positive knock-on effect that we've seen from that is a reduction in involvement in violence. But it's also important for you to see that these programmes tend to be very effective at their main aim. So there is a high increase in self-regulation for those young people going through the programme. And this is important on some of the interventions that look at things like bullying prevention and parenting programmes, looking at improving relationships between parents and carers and children, where we've looked at the violence outcomes, but these programmes have other aims as well. So I just thought it'd be helpful to take you through an example in the toolkit. So mentoring is a highly popular and highly prevalent intervention for violence prevention, and it's delivered in lots of different ways. So on average, from the research that's available, mentoring has a moderate impact on violence prevention. And we're saying that we've got a good level of confidence in this result. So it's scored a 3 out of 5 on the evidence quality rating. And that's dropped down because, like I say, there's a huge variation in the research that's available on mentoring and on the types of mentoring that's provided. So unsurprisingly, you see that variation in results come through in the overall average impact rating. And this also comes through as a high cost intervention, which is often a surprise to people because often mentoring programmes are delivered by volunteers. But actually, what we found in the research is that these programmes do have to invest quite a lot of money in the whole process of recruiting mentors, training mentors, keeping mentors engaged. And often there are other costs involved in providing spaces for children to meet up with mentors. Some of these programmes involve transport costs. And so just keeping the process moving of having trained mentors, keeping relationships with mentees effectively over what can be a period of 12 to 18 months sometimes, this can make it actually a high cost intervention. And we also share with you on the mentoring strand the average impact on reoffending. So the overall impact rating is focused on violence prevention, but you might be interested that on average mentoring has a moderate impact on reducing reoffending. So this is children, young people that are already involved with the justice system. And we've got a high level of confidence in that. We've got more studies that look specifically at crime and reoffending. So we've got slightly higher confidence in that result. And then, like I said earlier, as you click through each intervention type in the toolkit, you are provided with a bit more information. So under each strand, we have this "Is it effective?" section, where it expands on that overall impact rating and gives you any other useful information from the review. So for mentoring, the review showed us that on average mentoring has desirable impacts on reducing substance misuse, on reducing behavioural difficulties. It can improve educational outcomes and it can improve self-esteem. So again, depending on what you're looking at and what your focus is and what the needs of the children and young people are that you're working with, those might be useful pieces of information. And then in this section, we also share with you, what do we know about things that impact on how effective these programs are? So for mentoring, we know that they tend to have a larger impact on reducing violence when they work with children and young people that are at a higher risk of involvement in crime, which we have some theories about, but we probably need a bit more research on. But there might be something here about those teachable moments and or the quality of the mentoring provision and how focused the mentoring provision is on the specific needs of the child or young person involved. So what that means is when you're looking at the design of a mentoring intervention, if you're looking specifically at violence prevention, then we would be saying, have a look at the levels of risk of the children and young people that you're working with. Because actually, if the group of young people that are most likely to be recruited on and participate in the full mentoring programme, if their risk level was already low, then you're less likely to see the effect of these mentoring programmes in violence was higher. And unsurprisingly, probably mentoring programs tend to be more effective when they're delivered by people with counselling experience or some training in mentoring or counselling type services compared to when mentoring is provided by frontline roles. So often police officers or teachers, for example, who may not have had specific training in the provision of mentoring. And then just to add to this explanation of what you see in each toolkit strand, we have a section on implementation. Now, this section is relatively short because we've tried to keep the toolkit summaries as short, concise and easy to read as possible. But what this does is looks at the process and implementation evaluations that are available for each of the intervention types in the toolkit and pulls out some key messages about how can you implement these programs well. What are the types of things that you need to consider to maximise the engagement of children and young people on your violence prevention programme and or to maximise the impact of that programme. So very briefly, just to give mentoring as an example, and like I said earlier, with some of the challenges around keeping the costs down, there's quite a lot that needs to be considered in making sure that both your mentors and your mentees commit to a full programme. And so often that can be achieved through looking at actually what are the qualities and the motivations of the mentors that you're recruiting, and what are you doing to think about how you recruit a really diverse group of mentors that have the opportunity to sort of match up and develop a good rapport with the mentees. And is there provision of training available so that you can maximise the impact of those mentors and the qualities that are required for those mentors to have that positive impact for children and young people? And then specifically looking at the actual outcomes for mentees, what you see is that mentors that are provided with the opportunity to debrief, that are provided with some support, often able to maintain a relationship with their mentee for a bit longer. So they both might stay committed to the mentoring program for a bit longer, which provides more opportunity for those positive outcomes. And also you see that mentors tend to be more effective where they can adapt to what the mentor needs, which also comes from training and knowing the local area, knowing local services, and being able to refer children and young people into those services where needed. And often programs are more successful at keeping children and young people engaged for the full length of the mentoring program where they've involved parents or carers. So if parents or carers know where the child is supposed to be for the mentoring session and can help to make sure that they can make it there, that's more likely to lead to longer term engagement. And also, it's really important to manage the terminations of those mentoring relationships. So providing resources and contacts and referrals for those young people for follow-up services that they might need, but also just to make sure there's a really clear end date to maximise positive reflection on the process. So that gave you an example of the level of detail of one strand in the toolkit, and then I thought it might just be helpful to give you a very brief overview of the strands that are in the toolkit, and then perhaps in the questions section you can come back to me with anything specifically that you're interested in. So we've got 6 interventions that are in the toolkit that on average have a high impact on reducing violence. And so at the top here, you see a programme type called focused deterrence, which might be something that you've heard of or might not be. This is a practice that was developed over in the United States with quite a focus on gang-related violence. And it's something that we are currently testing in England and Wales. So this is an area where there's really positive results. This is about identifying groups of children and young people that are already involved in violence or at high risk of involvement in violence, and both providing support services, but also providing a very strong deterrence effect of demonstrating the knowledge and involvement of policing and the consequences of involvement in further offending. So it's quite a complex and complicated programme, but it's been quite well tested in the US. So we do say, you know, the evidence quality rating here is high, but that doesn't mean we don't still have questions. And our questions on this one are, we've seen some really good effects elsewhere in the world. It's been tried a few times in the UK, but we're now running some really robust trials to look at average impact in our context for children and young people living in an English and Welsh context. And just a couple of other things to point out here. So you'll see there's 2 different types of therapies in here. So cognitive behavioural therapy is an area with good level quality of evidence, can have a reduction of more than 30% of involvement in violence. So some really promising results for cognitive behavioural therapy. If you're able to engage children and young people in that type of therapy and ensure that they have access. So we know that there are many blockers to involvement in therapy. And so there are several areas of the toolkit where we say, look, we're telling you what the best evidence is, but there might still be quite a big policy agenda to do or a big service provision review to do. So there's quite a lot of work involved in making sure that children and young people have access to some of these intervention types where we feel quite confident about their high level of impact. And then there's some areas where there's really promising results, but only in a handful of studies. So YEF is funding more research to build up our confidence in the results. So sports programmes is an example of that. And sports programmes are really interesting because there's quite a lot going on in them. You know, in part, involvement in a sports programme can just be a physical diversion for children and young people away from the environment or the peer group in which they're more likely to be involved in violence. But also we know that involvement in sports can lead to increase in self-esteem. It can increase communication skills. It can improve sort of pro-social relationships with peers and develop new friendship groups. So there's some mechanisms for change there that are slightly different to just physically being removed from locations or environments related to violence prevention. But we also know that sports programmes are often led by a quite influential coach or role model. So there's a kind of role of a trusted adult here as well. And so having somebody that can provide a reliable, trusting, often mentoring relationship with a young person that might be at risk of involvement in violence could be one of the main things that make sports programmes effective. So YEF is funding research to have a look at some of these types of programmes and try to develop our understanding around those different components and what is it that makes sports programmes effective in violence prevention, so that we can make sure that that learning is captured, because these programmes are so wide in their delivery and very popular. At this point, I think I'll just move on to interventions that on average have a moderate impact on reducing violence. So there's several strands in this bracket at the moment, and you'll see that overall we've got quite a good level of quality, of evidence quality here. So quite a high level of confidence from YEF in the results here. So these are areas where, whilst we say on average, this is a moderate impact, so this might be something that's more like over a 10 to 20% reduction. It varies obviously by intervention type. But there's really promising results here, and often if you deliver these at scale, then there's real potential here for a good reduction in violence. And you'll also see that there's quite a variation in level of cost here. Some are more expensive than others. So pre-court diversion, just to briefly mention, is an area where we've got a good level of confidence in the results that are available to us at the moment. So this is diverting children and young people away from involvement in the justice system, using community resolutions, using youth cautions. And it is an area where we are producing some guidance. So later in the year, we'll have guidance about how best to implement diversion programmes, and what we can learn about the different needs of children and young people in different contexts and different situations. And this actually comes through as a low-cost intervention and is often built into parts of the current sort of service delivery and process for children and young people at risk or involved in the justice system. And you'll also see here we've got another kind of therapy. So there are a few different types of therapies that feature in the toolkit as moderate and high impact overall. So we will be producing guidance across the various therapies available for children and young people. But multi-systemic therapy looks at the child and their family unit, their peer group, their school, their local community, and takes an approach of bringing together the understanding of the child's context and their interactions and relationships and how some of those dynamics work. And this is an area, again, where much of the evidence is from the United States, but we are looking at what can we learn from that evidence and how can we apply it in the context that we're in. And I think, just to keep everything to time, I'm going to move on to those that have a on average low impact, but we can come back to any of the other strand types when we come to the Q&A session. So for interventions that currently on average have a low impact on violence prevention, so after school programmes, this is an area where we've got quite a good number of studies that have informed this low impact rating. And so basically what you see here is after school programmes can be quite effective at addressing behavioural difficulties and providing a safe space for children and young people. They might contribute to educational outcomes and other positive, desirable outcomes for children and young people. But when we look specifically for impact on reducing their involvement in violence at a later date, you just don't see it track through in the research. Similarly, so interventions to prevent school exclusion. So we absolutely understand that there is a relationship between being excluded from school, being absent from school, and risk of involvement in violence. But from the research that's available at the moment that looks at interventions that prevent school exclusions, we're not seeing that tracks through to a reduction in involvement in violence. So they might be effective at reducing school exclusions. Many of the studies showed that they weren't necessarily as effective at reducing suspensions. So there might be some questions there about actually how much are we reducing absence from school and does that have an impact? But there might also just be questions about the implementation of these types of interventions and whether any other support or interventions could be provided alongside these types of interventions to really address the needs of those young people. So there's some complexity going on in some of these interventions in the toolkit. So we do urge you to have a look at the toolkit strand if you've got the time to move beyond that overall impact rating. And similarly, so parenting programs and anti-bullying programs, like I said earlier, these types of interventions, so for their main aim, you do see positive results. So parenting programs do, on average, improve relationships between parents and carers and the children and young people that they are looking after. And they can lead to reductions in behavioural difficulties and reductions in aggression. But at the moment, the research isn't showing us that impact can follow through to violence prevention. And anti-bullying can reduce bullying, can have a moderate impact on reducing bullying, but not at the moment seeing that track through to violence prevention. And so just to briefly wrap up, there's several strands in the toolkit where actually we haven't got an impact rating because we haven't got the types of evaluation available that will tell us what the average impact is for children and young people going through or experiencing this intervention compared to those that haven't experienced the intervention. So what we do when we have these areas, and we use and we include areas in the toolkit where we know there's popular or prevalent practice. So we know these practices are happening. So we want to be able to tell you, we have had a look at these areas and found that we haven't got this kind of impact evidence that we need. So instead, we describe what the state of the research evidence base is at the moment, and we tell you what we learned from the implementation or process evaluations, which can be helpful in the design of these interventions, or if you're reviewing them, you might want to consider some of the things that are included in those toolkit strands. And this can also just be quite telling for people where they might be real big supporters of police in schools, for example. It can be quite a helpful process to go through of thinking about the lack of evidence that there is for police in schools reducing involvement in violence. And so that has to be considered when we've got such tight resources and such a lot to do in terms of service delivery. If we think about what are our best bets for violence prevention, then we're not suggesting that resources are diverted away from these areas where the impact is unknown, but it needs to be considered as part of the suite of interventions or services that you're reviewing or looking at in your local area. So many people frown at me when I say trauma-informed training and service redesign is currently here, because morally and ethically it just feels like the right thing to do. And there's a lot of evidence for children and young people and their experience of trauma and how that interacts with their risk of involvement in violence and how they interact with services and justice services in particular. So we understand that wider context, but like I say, at the moment, we haven't got any evidence that training up organisations in trauma-informed approaches has an impact on reducing violence. So we're not saying don't do it, we're just being really clear about that evidence base. And so you'll see similar results there for media campaigns and knife crime education programmes. Again, seems intuitively correct, but we have some questions there about the practice. And then just very briefly, there's a couple of interventions in the toolkit that have actually shown to increase children and young people's involvement in violence if they have participated in these programmes compared to those that haven't. And so these are boot camps and prison awareness camps. And so these types of approaches take often a sort of fear-based approach to violence prevention. So boot camps will take a high discipline approach and an authoritarian approach to disciplining and managing the behaviour of children and young people whilst they're on that programme. And prison awareness camps will take children and young people into prisons to demonstrate to them the consequences and the realities of time spent in prison. And actually what you see is immediately after these programs, there might be a change in attitudes towards involvement in violence or involvement with the justice system, in that most young people will go on these programs and say, yes, I will change my behaviour and I don't want to be involved in violence and I don't want to end up in prison. But when you actually look at the evidence, it really is overwhelming that it doesn't deter those young people from involvement in offending and involvement with the justice system at a later date. And so just to briefly wrap up so that we've got time for questions, this is a live resource, so we're always adding new strands to the toolkit. So we are currently reviewing the evidence for CCTV and street lighting as environmental approaches to violence prevention. So those will be added at the end of this month. And we're currently reviewing the evidence for school-based drug prevention programs. So this is an area where we know we've got outcomes for children and young people's use of drugs or some substances, and we know that there's a relationship between substance use and risk of involvement in violence. So we'll examine some of that. And then we have another type of therapy to add to the list, so functional family therapy. And so, like I say, I think this means we'll have 4 different types of therapy in the toolkit. And so we will be producing some guidance on how to think through and take decisions about types of therapies that might be best for the different needs of children and young people. And also, you know, there might be differences in what's available in different areas of the country. And then to wrap up, so future topics. So these are areas where we've commissioned reviews of the global evidence that's available on their impact on violence prevention. And so these will be landing much later in the year, autumn and winter. So arts participation. So this includes creative arts and music. So we've looked at the evidence that's available, and YEF has also opened a grant round on funding promising projects and programmes around arts participation and prevention of involvement in violence. So this is an area where we'll be collecting the existing research, but also contributing to that evidence base as well. And summer jobs programme. So this is a type of programme where children and young people are given opportunities to be involved in employment. So an opportunity to create some income and also to participate in a work-based environment. And so we're looking at the existing evidence available, but also looking at potentially what could YEF do to fund these types of programmes and test them in the UK. And then we're also looking at post-custody aftercare programmes. And so there's some good evidence on this, but we've got some questions at the moment about whether this is a bit US heavy and what can we learn that's relevant to the English and Welsh context. We're sort of constantly looking at the evidence base and finding areas where there's just more research has been commissioned and undertaken in other contexts. And so part of our work is figuring out how can we learn from this evidence in other contexts, and then how much research do we need to commission ourselves in England and Wales to try and fill some of those gaps. And we already have school exclusions and restorative justice in the toolkit, but new evidence comes to light. So we have commissioned 2 updates to look at the reviews of evidence to include some of those studies that have been published more recently. So those updates will land over the winter as well. So there's always a reason to check back in on the toolkit for updates. And if you don't want to have to remember to do that yourself, then I would kindly suggest that you sign up for our newsletter, which just means that you get a quarterly email that will tell you any new strands that have been added to the toolkit, any new grants or funding that's available from YEF, and any other updates from the organisation. So you'll see that if you type in Youth Endowment Fund /newsletter, or just go on the website and you'll find it. Equally, you can just email me. So I am laura.knight at Youth Endowment Fund. And I'm really happy to answer questions on email, or we can set up a call and chat about toolkit evidence. Equally, if there's other parts of YEF that you're interested in, feel free to get in touch with me, and then I can put you in touch with the right people, particularly if it's on the funding side. I'll make sure I put you in touch with the right programmes people. So yeah, I think I'll hand back to Wayne at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Very comprehensive and informative presentation that around the toolkit. And if I could ask for you just to share your presentation with me, please, following this meeting, I can then distribute that amongst our attendees. So thanks again very much. I'm sure everybody here is appreciative of you taking time out this afternoon to speak to us. We will invite questions now, so if anyone has a question, please do raise your hand virtually or physically if you prefer. Don't be shy. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Really interesting. And just to say, I've got a bit of an interest in this because I'm part of a team that's been evaluating some of the family intervention projects for the YEF over the last couple of years, and those reports are about to be published very soon, I think. So I do know a little bit about YEF from that element of it. Really interested in the idea of the evidence-based approach. Another discussion another time, maybe, in the development of what type of evidence. But I'd be really interested to know. I also do work with NICE, and what we've done over the last few years is look at all of their evidence, say, hey, what could this mean for social workers? So we've produced a number of guides to say, look, this is how what we've learned from this you can actually do in your practice. And I may have missed it, maybe YEF are doing it already, but I'd be interested to know what might be. I suppose from our point of view about BASW, management and practitioners, is how can we best make use of that evidence for really busy practitioners actually trying to do something different in their work. So a comment and a question, please, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. So I mentioned that we're producing these guidance reports, although I think...
Laura, sorry, I've missed the first 9 or 10 minutes, so maybe you said it then. Apologies.
Okay.
Wayne had to send me the link again. I'd lost the link. Sorry. Go on.
I shall share the slides, but at the beginning I presented our sort of plan on a page, and in that I said one of the products that we're going through a process of producing now are these guidance reports, so that they bring together lots of evidence and get into the detail. But what might be mildly frustrating is that it takes quite a lot of time to do that. So we're producing the first one, which will be on diversion, towards the end of this year. And then we have a series of focus areas. So we'll be producing, I think the one after that will be on therapies. And so the role of the family might be the one after that. So there might be some time delay there. Otherwise, what I would say is we haven't necessarily got products at the moment that would support at the frontline level, but we do have me and a team of change people that often go out and run workshops. We often do that with youth justice teams or policing teams and violence reduction units, where we sit down with people and really try to have discussions about what's important to you, what questions have you got, which areas of practice are you interested in, and then we'll tell you what we know from the evidence, so that you in an hour or two can pick through to the bits that you actually want to know about and are really relevant to the questions and the practice that you've got at that moment. But that obviously is a bit more time intensive and, would take a lot of time to roll that out nationally across social workers. So I shall take back the question about what guide or product could we produce that would specifically help social workers.
Thanks, Laura. Just one quick comment and another quick question, if I may, is that would be really helpful. And I just wonder if that was something YEF was taking forward, whether there might be some value in, because you'll have different constituents. You've got social workers, you've got the police, you've got everyone who wants to know about all that stuff. I appreciate that. But if there was a specific area for like social worker, one of those groups, might be worthwhile trying to get a group of practitioners together to kind of road test it. Say, look, this is what we're looking at. What's the most useful way to present this stuff? Because people don't have time to read things in practice or necessarily management. So just a thought. And the other thing is, how do you work with the What Works Centre, the Children's What Works Centre? Because there could be some crossover points there, I think.
Yeah, so we have a really good relationship with them, and they actually helped really to set up the YEF. So a lot of what we do and a lot of our practices have come from their wealth of experience. And so we have a couple of, I'm going to keep saying EIF, but I know they changed their name. We have a couple of their members on the Youth Endowment Fund board, and they're involved in our sort of strategy development and review and those types of things. So we definitely go through a process of learning from them and building on that learning. But I wonder if you're thinking of something more specific, like have they maybe produced something that you found really helpful that you'd like to see YEF do something similar?
I think they've worked on a number of interesting areas. I guess I think you've answered it. At the strategic level, you obviously got those links so that either not duplicating too much or overlap, where there's overlap, to try and pull it together, I guess. So that was really it, Laura. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Do we have any other questions or comments from anybody? No. Okay, I have a question myself, Laura. I guess it's a little bit more upstream and political with a small p, to Brian's question, in that having worked in sort of frontline services myself earlier on in my career, both in a intensive supervision and surveillance project, and then that was for the Youth Offending Service in my native Sheffield, and then also an intensive control and change programme, which is a similar programme for young people aged between 18 and 25, and to stem the repeat offending that some of them were drawn into, which was overseen by the probation service. So there has been innovations like you've described in your presentation in the recent past. And one of the clear kind of obstacles, I guess, with keeping those initiatives permanent or making them permanent and embedded in frontline practice and service delivery, a lot of that's around funding, I guess, and the lack of investment that there's been, and particularly over the last 12 or 13 years, actually, austerity. I just wondered what more you felt could be done to encourage government to invest more appropriately in some of these services that you've done, like mentoring and specific to workers and education and training and so on. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it's a great question. And I suppose the position of the YEF means that we are taking an approach that is, let's value what we can learn from evidence and spend our resources on areas that are more promising and are more likely to have the type of impact that we want to see. So we spend a lot of time working across the government departments that are related to, to education, to policing, to provision of youth services. And also, more broadly, just thinking about how systems interact. And we have some work going on at the moment thinking about systems thinking and systems approaches. And so I suppose at that level, we're saying this is what we understand about the problems and the issues of youth violence. And this is what we know about some of the causal factors and some of the risk factors related to children and young people's involvement in violence. And then this is what we know about what works. And so we're constantly, banging the drum basically for, longer term investment in those types of services. And I think the other way that we work is with our change team and with me sort of running around the country constantly talking to practitioners, is to try and create a bit of a groundswell of support for interventions that work, but also for looking at the quality of the implementation of these programs. So I use mentoring as an example there, because there's a lot of mentoring programs that happen, but there's probably a lot of mentoring programs that don't have much impact. Because they might not be well funded, and they might be, they might not be being delivered for long enough and for the right people to have an impact. So partly it's investing in the right things, and partly it's delivering them really well. So I like to think YEF is doing its best to contribute to and to facilitate some of those discussions about bigger change. But I hear you. There are some areas of the system where there's not enough money.
This is maybe across the country. Thanks again, Laura.
Thanks for having me.